The North Atlantic Ocean was cold and dark in the winter of 1939. Giant waves crashed against the sides of merchant ships carrying food, medicine, and weapons to Britain. The sailors on these ships knew they were in danger. Somewhere beneath the black water, German submarines were waiting to kill them. These submarines were called U-boats. The letter U came from the German word Unterseeboot, which meant undersea boat. They were long and narrow, painted gray like sharks. They could dive deep below the surface and stay hidden for hours. When they attacked, they came without warning. A merchant ship would be sailing peacefully one moment, and the next moment it would explode in flames as a torpedo tore through its hull. The man in charge of these deadly submarines was Admiral Karl Dönitz. He was a thin man with sharp eyes and a mind like a calculator. During the First World War, he had been a U-boat captain himself. He understood submarines better than almost anyone alive. Now in his office in Berlin, he moved small models across a map of the Atlantic Ocean. Each model represented one of his U-boats. Each day, he planned new attacks on British shipping. Dönitz had a dream. He wanted to build a fleet of 300 submarines. With that many U-boats, he believed he could strangle Britain. The island nation depended on ships to bring everything it needed. If Dönitz could sink enough ships, the British people would starve. They would run out of fuel. They would have no bullets for their guns. They would be forced to surrender without a single German soldier setting foot on British soil. But there was a problem. Germany was not supposed to have any submarines at all. After the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles had banned Germany from building them. The other countries of Europe believed that submarines were too dangerous, too cruel. They had seen how U-boats killed thousands of innocent sailors during the Great War. They never wanted to see such slaughter again. Adolf Hitler did not care about the treaty. In 1935, he announced that Germany would rebuild its military. Secret submarine construction had already been happening for years. German engineers had designed new U-boats in Holland and Finland, pretending to work for foreign governments. Now these designs were brought home. Shipyards across Germany began building submarines as fast as they could. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and started the Second World War, Dönitz had 57 submarines ready for battle. It was not the 300 he wanted, but it was enough to begin. He sent his U-boats into the Atlantic with simple orders. Find the enemy. Sink their ships. Show no mercy across the ocean in London. A young naval officer named Frederick Thornton sat in a basement room beneath the Admiralty building. The room was cold and filled with radio equipment. Thornton's job was to listen. Day and night, his team monitored radio signals from across the Atlantic. Most of what they heard was ordinary traffic. Ships reporting their positions. Weather stations broadcasting forecasts. Merchants talking to their home ports. But sometimes, Thornton heard something different. Strange signals in Morse code. Dots and dashes that made no sense. The messages were encrypted, scrambled into nonsense by some kind of coding machine. Thornton could not read them, but he knew what they were. These were messages from German U-boats, talking to their headquarters in Berlin. The problem was that knowing the messages existed did not help very much. Thornton could not understand what they said. He could not tell where the submarines were hiding. All he could do was mark down the time and frequency of each transmission and hope that someday this information would become useful. Meanwhile, merchant sailors were dying. In the first 4 months of the war, German U-boats sank over 200 ships. The attacks happened without warning. A torpedo would strike in the middle of the night. Men would wake up to the sound of explosions and screaming. They would rush to the deck to find their ship already sinking beneath them. Many died before they could reach the lifeboats. Others made it into the water only to freeze to death in the icy Atlantic. The survivors told terrible stories. They spoke of oil fires burning on the water. They described watching their friends drown. Some had floated for days before being rescued, drinking salt water and going mad from thirst. The lucky ones were picked up by other ships. The unlucky ones simply disappeared, their bodies never found. In Germany, the U-boat commanders became heroes. Their pictures appeared in newspapers and magazines. They received medals from Hitler himself. Young men across the country dreamed of joining the submarine service. They wanted the glory and the adventure. They did not yet understand that most of them would never come home. One of these young commanders was Capitan Lieutenant Werner Hartmann. He was 28 years old, tall and confident. His crew respected him because he was calm under pressure and never asked them to take risks he would not take himself. In October 1939, Hartmann took his submarine, U-37, into the Atlantic hunting ground. On his first patrol, Hartmann sank 5 ships. He attacked at night when the submarines were hardest to see. He used his deck gun to save torpedoes, surfacing and firing shells directly at merchant vessels. The British ships had no weapons to fight back. They could only try to run, but U-37 was faster. After each attack, Hartmann sent a radio message back to headquarters. He reported his position, the ships he had sunk, and how many torpedoes he had left. These messages were encrypted using a machine called Enigma. Hartmann believed these codes were unbreakable. He had no idea that every time he pressed the transmit button, he was sending a signal that the British could detect. Back in London, Thornton marked another transmission on his chart. He still could not read the message, but he noticed something interesting. The signal had come from a specific direction. If he could get another listening station to detect the same transmission, he might be able to calculate where the U-boat was located. It was like using 2 points to draw a line on a map. Where the lines crossed would be a submarine. This idea would later become one of the most important weapons of the war. But in late 1939, it was just a theory. Thornton did not have enough listening stations. He did not have the equipment to make quick calculations. All he could do was keep listening and keep hoping. Then, on a freezing night in December, something changed. A U-boat somewhere in the North Atlantic had been damaged in a storm. Its captain had no choice but to surface and call for help. The radio operator sent out a distress signal. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, SOS. The universal call for help. This SOS was different from the encrypted messages. It was sent in plain Morse code so that any ship might hear it and come to help. The German captain was desperate. He did not care who received his signal. He just wanted to survive. Thornton heard the transmission clearly. For the first time, he had a signal from a U-boat that told him exactly what was happening. A German submarine was in trouble, and it was calling for rescue. More importantly, Thornton could calculate the direction the signal came from. He picked up his telephone and called his superiors. This was the moment everything began to change. The shadows beneath the waves were about to be dragged into the light. The old Victorian mansion stood in the English countryside, surrounded by green lawns and wooden huts. From the outside, it looked like nothing special. A few guards stood at the gates. Workers came and went on bicycles. No signs explained what happened inside. The place was called Bletchley Park and held one of the greatest secrets of the war. Inside those huts, some of the brightest minds in Britain worked day and night on a single problem. They were trying to break the German codes. Every message sent by the German military was encrypted using a machine called Enigma. This machine scrambled letters in millions of possible combinations. The Germans believed no one could ever crack it. They were wrong. The man leading the effort was named Alan Turing. He was young, awkward, and brilliant. Other scientists thought in straight lines, but Turing thought in circles and spirals. He could see patterns where others saw only chaos. While his colleagues struggled with the Enigma problem using pencil and paper, Turing designed a machine to do the work faster. He called it the bomb. The bomb was not a weapon that exploded. It was a calculating machine, a primitive computer made of spinning wheels and clicking gears. When fed enough encrypted messages, it could test thousands of possible settings until it found the right one. Each day, German operators reset their Enigma machines to new settings. Each day, Turing and his team had to crack the code all over again. The breakthrough came slowly. First, the codebreakers learned to read German Air Force messages. Then they cracked Army communications. But the Navy codes were different. They were more complex, more carefully protected. The U-boats seemed to speak a language that even Bletchley Park could not understand. Meanwhile, in London, Commander Roger Wynne sat in a cramped room deep beneath the Admiralty. He was not a sailor. He was a lawyer who had joined the Navy when the war began. Wynne walked with a heavy limp, the result of childhood polio. His body was weak, but his mind was razor-sharp. Wynne ran the submarine tracking. Broom. His job was to figure out where the German U-boats were hiding. He did not have decoded messages. He did not have spies inside the German Navy. All he had was radio signals, reports from ship captains, and his own remarkable intuition. Every day, Wynne's team plotted information on a huge map of the Atlantic Ocean. They marked where ships had been attacked. They noted where radio signals had been detected. They drew lines showing where convoys were traveling and where U-boats might be waiting. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. Wynne noticed that U-boats always sent radio messages before and after attacks. When a submarine spotted a convoy, it reported the location to headquarters. When it sank a ship, it reported its success. These messages were encrypted, but the signals themselves could be detected. Each transmission gave away the submarine's general position. The British developed a technology called high-frequency direction finding, nicknamed HFY. Special receivers on ships and shores could detect a radio transmission and determine what direction it came from. If two or more stations detected the same signal, they could draw lines on a map. Where the lines crossed, there was a U-boat. HFY worked even when the messages could not be decoded. The Germans did not realize that every time they used their radios, they were revealing themselves to the enemy. Admiral Dönitz believed his communications were perfectly secure. He kept ordering his submarines to send detailed reports. Each report made Wynne's job a little easier, but HFY was not enough on its own. It could tell you roughly where a submarine was at the moment it transmitted. By the time ships arrived to hunt it down, the U-boat had usually moved. Wynne needed more information. He needed to know what the Germans were planning, not just where they had been. The answer came on a stormy day in May 1941. A convoy escort group led by HMS Bulldog was hunting a U-boat in the North Atlantic. They found it on the surface, damaged by depth charges. The German captain gave the order to abandon ship. His crew scrambled out of the hatches and jumped into the freezing water. They expected their submarine to sink, but U-110 did not sink. It floated, wounded but alive. The captain of HMS Bulldog saw an opportunity. He ordered his men to board the German vessel. It was incredibly dangerous. The submarine might go down at any moment. There might be explosives set to destroy secret equipment. The sailors did not hesitate. They climbed down into the dark interior of the U-boat. Water was flooding in. The lights were out. Using flashlights, they searched the control room. They found exactly what Wynne and his colleagues had been praying for. Sitting on a table was an Enigma machine with all its rotors in place. Next to it were codebooks, instruction manuals, and setting sheets. The Germans had not had time to destroy them. The capture of U-110 changed everything. Within weeks, Bletchley Park was reading German naval messages. The codes that had protected the U-boat fleet were broken. For the first time, the British knew exactly what Dönitz was planning. They could see where wolf packs were gathering. They could read the orders sent to every submarine in the Atlantic. Wynne's tracking room became incredibly powerful. Before, he had been guessing where U-boats might be. Now he knew where they were. He could read their patrol orders. He could see which submarines were low on fuel or torpedoes. He could tell which ones were heading home and which ones were just starting their hunts. Convoys began avoiding U-boat concentrations. Ships that would have sailed straight into ambushes were rerouted around the danger zones. Losses dropped dramatically. Merchant sailors who should have died reached their destination safely. They never knew that codebreakers in an English mansion had saved their lives. Dönitz noticed that something was wrong. His U-boats were finding fewer convoys. The British seemed to know where his submarines were hiding. He suspected that there might be spies in his organization, or perhaps the British had broken some minor codes. He never imagined that they were reading everything. The admiral ordered his U-boats to change their tactics. He created larger wolf packs. He spread them across wider areas of ocean. He demanded more radio reports, believing that better communication would lead to better results. He did not understand that more communication meant more chances for the British to track his submarines, Every SOS signal, every attack report, every weather observation became a weapon in British hands. The U-boats were still dangerous. They still sank ships and killed sailors. But they were no longer invisible. The hunters had become the hunted. In his basement room, Wynne updated his map each day. Red pins showed known U-boat positions. Blue lines showed convoy routes. Green marks showed where submarines had been sunk. The green marks were becoming more common. The tide of battle was beginning to turn. But the war was far from over. The Germans would soon improve their Enigma machines. They would add new rotors and new codes. The race between codemakers and codebreakers would continue. And in the dark waters of the Atlantic, thousands of men on both sides would continue to die. The year 1942 began with disaster for the Allies. America had just entered the war after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States was strong and wealthy, but it was not ready for the U-boat threat. German submarines sailed right up to the American coast and found easy targets waiting for them. The U-boat commanders called it the second happy time. American cities refused to turn off their lights at night. Ships sailing along the coast were silhouetted against the glow of New York, Miami, and New Orleans. The submarines did not even need to hunt. They simply waited offshore and watched the targets parade past them. Capana Lieutenant Reinhard Hartigan took his submarine, U-2-123, into American waters in January 1942. On his first patrol, he sank 8 ships within sight of the American shore. People standing on beaches could see the explosions. Oil from torpedoed tankers washed up on the sand. Bodies of drowned sailors floated in the surf. America was learning the terror that Britain had known for 2 years. Admiral Dunitz was delighted. He sent more submarines to the American coast. By spring, U-boats were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build new ones. The tonnage numbers were staggering. In just 6 months, German submarines destroyed over 3 million tons of shipping. Entire convoys disappeared without survivors. But the Americans learned quickly. They organized convoys with armed escorts. They built patrol aircraft that could cover the coastal waters. They installed blackout rules in their cities. Most importantly, they began building ships at an incredible rate. Henry Kaiser's shipyards produced new merchant vessels in just 45 days. The ships were simple and ugly, but they floated and they carried cargo. Back in the mid-Atlantic, the real battle was just beginning. There was a gap in the ocean that aircraft could not reach. Flying from Britain in the east or Canada in the west, patrol planes ran out of fuel before they could cover the center of the Atlantic. The Germans called this gap the Black Pit. It was where the wolf packs hunted. Wolfpack was a group of submarines working together. When one U-boat spotted a convoy, it did not attack alone. Instead, it sent a radio message to headquarters. Dunitz would then order other submarines in the area to gather around the convoy. When enough U-boats had arrived, they attacked together. Usually at night, the Wolfpack tactic was devastatingly effective. A convoy protected by a few escort ships might fight off one submarine. But when 12 or 15 U-boats attacked from all directions at once, the escorts could not be everywhere. Ships exploded left and right. The surface of the ocean burned with spilled oil. Survivors screamed in the darkness while the submarines slipped away. Commander Wynne in London watched these battles unfold with growing frustration. He could track the U-boats. He could read their messages. He knew where the wolf packs were gathering, but he could not stop them. There were not enough escort ships. There were not enough aircraft. The convoys had to sail through the Black Pit, and the wolves were waiting. Then, in February 1942, disaster struck Bletchley Park. The Germans upgraded their Enigma machines. They added a 4th rotor to the 3 that already scrambled their messages. Suddenly, the naval codes went dark. The mathematicians worked frantically, but they could not crack the new system. For 10 terrible months, the British could not read U-boat communications. Wynne had to rely on Huff Duff alone. He plotted radio transmissions and made educated guesses. He studied German tactics and predicted where submarines would strike. He was often right, but he was not always right. Ships died because of his mistakes. Wind carried that weight every day. The turning point came in May 1943. By then, the British had cracked the new Enigma codes. They had built more escort ships and longer-range aircraft. They had developed new weapons, like more effective depth charges and forward-throwing mortars. Most importantly, they had trained crews who knew how to fight submarines. Convoy. ONS 5 was sailing from Canada to Britain with 43 merchant ships. Dönitz ordered over 40 U-boats to intercept it. This would be the largest Wolfpack attack of the war. The Germans expected an easy victory. They were wrong. The escort commander, Peter Gretton, was a veteran who understood U-boat tactics. His ships carried the latest Huff-Duff equipment. When a submarine transmitted its position, Gretton knew about it within minutes. He positioned his escorts to intercept the attackers before they could reach the convoy. The battle lasted 5 days. Waves crashed over the ships in a terrible storm. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The U-boats attacked again and again, but they could not break through. Gretton's escorts were everywhere, dropping depth charges, firing guns, ramming submarines that surfaced too close. When it was over, the convoy had lost 13 ships. Normally, that would have been a German victory. But this time, 6 U-boats had been sunk. Hundreds of German sailors were dead. For the first time, the cost of attacking a convoy was higher than the benefit. Dönitz read the reports with disbelief. In May 1943 alone, he lost 41 submarines. That was nearly 1 U-boat per day. His captains were reporting that the enemy seemed to know their positions. Every time they gathered to attack, escorts appeared as if by magic. Depth charges fell on them before they could dive deep enough to escape. The admiral did not understand how his fleet had been exposed. He ordered an investigation into security leaks. His experts assured him that Enigma was unbreakable. They blamed bad luck, improved Allied technology, increased air patrols. They never guessed the truth. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz made a painful decision. He ordered all U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic. The hunting ground, where his submarines had killed thousands of ships, was now too dangerous. The wolves were retreating. In London, the codebreakers celebrated quietly. They could not tell anyone what they had done. The secret of Enigma was too valuable to risk. If the Germans learned their codes were broken, they would create new ones. So the mathematicians and radio operators stayed silent, while others took the credit. Commander Wynne updated his map one final time that day. Where once he had tracked dozens of U-boats in the Atlantic, now he saw them running for home. The battle was not over. The Germans would return with new tactics and new technology. But the worst was past. The deadliest fleet in history had been dragged into the light, and it would never recover. The sailors who crossed the Atlantic in the months that followed never knew how close they had come to death. They never knew about the listening stations or the code breakers or the tracking room deep beneath London. They only knew that the submarines attacked less often now, and more ships reached port safely. For them, that was enough. Admiral Dönitz sat alone in his office, staring at the casualty reports. The numbers were devastating. In the first 5 months of 1943, he had lost 96 submarines and over 5,000 trained sailors. The U-boat force was bleeding to death. He knew something had gone terribly wrong. His submarines were being found too easily. Convoys changed course just before Wolfpacks could attack. Aircraft appeared over surfaced U-boats with impossible accuracy. Either the British had some new detection technology, or there was a traitor in the German Navy. Dönitz ordered both possibilities. Investigated, his security experts examined the Enigma system carefully. They tested it against the best German mathematicians. They concluded that it was absolutely secure. No one could break Enigma. The codes were safe. The technical experts offered another explanation. British radar had improved dramatically. New aircraft carried equipment that could detect a surfaced submarine from miles away. The U-boats needed time on the surface to recharge their batteries and refresh their air. This made them vulnerable. Dönitz accepted this explanation because it came with a solution. German engineers had been developing a device called the Schnorkel. It was a breathing tube that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while staying just below the surface. With the Schnorkel, U-boats would not need to surface completely. Only a small tube would stick above the water. It's too small for radar to detect. The Navy rushed to install snorkels on every available submarine. They also developed new torpedoes that could hone in on the sound of ship engines. These acoustic torpedoes did not need precise aiming. They chased their targets like hunting dogs following a scent. Dönitz believed these new technologies would turn the tide. He began planning a return to the Atlantic. His submarine force had been rebuilt with fresh boats and new crews. Many of the veteran captains were dead, but young officers were ready to take their place. The wolf packs would hunt again, but the British knew his plans before he executed them. Every order Dönitz sent was intercepted and decoded. Bletchley Park read his messages about the snorkel. They learned about the acoustic torpedoes. They passed this information to the naval commanders who needed to defeat these new threats. The Allies developed countermeasures with remarkable speed. Against acoustic torpedoes, they created devices called Foxers. These were noisemakers towed behind ships. The torpedoes chased the Foxers instead of the ships. Against the snorkel submarines, they improved their radar until they could detect even a small tube breaking the surface. The U-boats returned to battle in late 1943, but they found the Atlantic more dangerous than ever. Aircraft patrolled constantly, armed with depth charges and homing torpedoes. Escort carrier groups roamed the seas, hunting submarines like mobile fortresses. The Black Pit was closing. There was nowhere left to hide. In June 1944, the Allies invaded Normandy. This was the moment Dönitz had prepared for. He ordered every available U-boat to attack the invasion fleet. Hundreds of ships, carrying soldiers and supplies, were crossing the English Channel. If the submarines could sink enough of them, the invasion might fail. But the invasion waters were the most heavily defended in the world. Aircraft flew constant patrols. Destroyers crisscrossed the channel with active sonar. The U-boats could not get close. Those that tried were detected and destroyed. In the crucial first days of the invasion, German submarines sank almost nothing. The worst blow came on June 4, 1944. Just 2 days before the invasion began, an American hunter-killer group led by the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal was patrolling off the coast of Africa. They detected a submarine and began attacking with depth charges. The submarine was U-505. It was commanded by Captain Lieutenant Harold Long. The depth charges damaged his boat badly. Water flooded in. The lights went out. Lange believed the submarine was sinking. He ordered his crew to abandon ship. The Americans saw the crew jumping into the water and realized the submarine might not sink. Captain Daniel Gallery of the Guadalcanal made a daring decision. He ordered his sailors to board the U-boat and prevent it from going down. Armed boarding parties climbed onto the hull of U-505. They opened the hatches and went inside, not knowing if the submarine was booby-trapped. In the darkness, they found water pouring in and closed the valves that were letting it enter. They disconnected explosives that the Germans had set to destroy the boat. They captured the submarine intact. More importantly, they captured everything inside. The Americans found Enigma machines with current settings. They found code books and cipher keys. They found acoustic torpedo manuals and recognition signals. U-505 was a treasure chest of German secrets. The capture was so valuable that the American Navy kept it completely secret. The crew of the Guadalcanal were sworn to silence. The German survivors were held in isolated prison camps where they could not communicate with anyone. Even the families of the captured sailors were not told their sons and husbands were alive. For the rest of the war, the Allies used the captured materials to stay ahead of German code changes. Every time the Germans updated their Enigma settings, the information from U-505 helped Bletchley Park break them faster. Admiral Dönitz never learned what had happened. He believed U-505 had been sunk with all hands. He continued to trust his communications, never knowing that the enemy was reading every word. By 1945, the U-boat war was lost. German submarines still sailed, but they rarely returned. For every Allied ship they sank, 7 or 8 U-boats were destroyed. Young sailors who had dreamed of glory found only death in the cold Atlantic and German ports. The remaining U-boats sat idle, Fuel was running out. Trained crews were becoming scarce. The new Type 21 submarines, which could have changed the war, arrived too late and too few. The greatest submarine fleet ever assembled had been defeated not by bigger ships or stronger bombs, but by invisible waves of radio signals and the brilliant minds that learned to decode them. The final irony was bitter. The U-boats had been designed for secrecy. They attacked from hiding and vanished without a trace. But every time they used their radios, every time they sent a distress signal or an attack report, they betrayed themselves. The very communications that made Wolfpack tactics possible had led to the destruction of the Wolfpack's Dunnets, had built his strategy on the belief that his submarines were invisible. He was wrong. The British had learned to see in the dark, and once the shadows were penetrated, the deadliest fleet in history became nothing more than targets. The war ended on a cold morning in May 1945. German radio stations broadcast the message of surrender. Across Europe, guns fell silent. Soldiers put down their weapons and waited for orders that would send them home. In the ports of northern Germany, a strange ceremony was taking place. U-boat crews were destroying their own submarines. Men who had sailed these vessels through storms and battles now opened the valves that would send them to the bottom. In Kiel, 26 boats sank at their moorings. In Flensburg, 56 more went down. Over 200 submarines were scuttled. By their own sailors in the final days of the war, these men chose to destroy their boats rather than surrender them to the enemy. Perhaps they were following orders. Perhaps they felt shame at their defeat. Perhaps they simply could not bear to see enemy flags flying over the vessels that had been their homes. Whatever the reason, they sent the greatest submarine fleet in history to the ocean floor. Admiral Dönitz did not witness the end of his fleet. Hitler had named him as his successor just before killing himself. For a few strange days, Dönitz was the leader of Germany. His only task was to negotiate the surrender. Then he was arrested by British soldiers and taken to prison to await trial for war crimes in London. Commander Roger Wynne closed down his tracking room. The maps that had saved so many lives were rolled up and stored away. The men and women who had worked through the war years were thanked quietly and sent home. Most of them never spoke about what they had done. The secret of how they had defeated the U-boats was too important to share. At Bletchley Park, the codebreakers faced an unusual order. They were told to destroy their work. The bomb machines that had cracked Enigma were taken apart. Notes and documents were burned. The mathematicians who had performed miracles were instructed to forget everything they had learned. The British government wanted no one to know that codes could be broken. Alan Turing returned to academic life. He continued his work on computing machines and artificial intelligence, but the achievements that should have made him famous remained classified. He could not tell anyone that his inventions had helped win the war. He died in 1954, still bound by secrecy. His contributions unknown to the public, the secret held for decades. It was not until the 1970s that the truth about Ultra, the code name for the intelligence gained from breaking Enigma, began to emerge. Books were written. Documents were declassified. The world finally learned how a group of mathematicians and linguists working in a country mansion had changed the course of history. The statistics of the Battle of the Atlantic were staggering. German U-boats sank over 3,500 Allied ships during the war. Millions of tons of supplies destined for Britain and the Soviet Union went to the bottom of the ocean. Over 30,000 merchant sailors lost their lives, but the cost to Germany was equally terrible. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in the U-boat force, approximately 30,000 died. That was a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any military branch in any nation during the war. 3 out of every 4 U-boat sailors never came home. The submarines that had seemed so powerful, so invincible, became iron coffins. Young men who had volunteered for glory found themselves trapped in steel tubes, listening to depth charges explode around them. Waiting for the hull to crack and the sea to rush in, some U-boats were never found. They simply disappeared, their final moments unknown. Others were discovered years later by deep-sea explorers. The wrecks lay on the ocean floor, covered in rust and sea life. Monuments to a terrible chapter of human history. one submarine survived to tell the story. U-2505, captured by the Americans off Africa, was towed across the Atlantic and brought to the United States. After the war, it was preserved as a museum ship. Today it sits in Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry. It's visited by millions of people each year. Children climb through its narrow corridors. They peer at the torpedo tubes and the tiny bunks where sailors slept. They stand in the control room where desperate men made life-and-death decisions. Most visitors do not fully understand what they are seeing. They do not grasp the fear and courage and tragedy that the submarine represents. The captured Enigma machine from U-505 is displayed nearby. It looks like an old typewriter with some extra parts. Visitors glance at it and move on, not realizing that this simple device once protected the deadliest fleet in the world. Not understanding that breaking its code cost countless hours of human genius and saved countless human lives. Winston Churchill, who led Britain through the darkest years of the war, later wrote about the U-boat threat. He said it was the only thing that truly frightened him. More than the bombing of London, more than the German army, more than the possibility of invasion, Churchill feared the submarines that were strangling his island nation. The defeat of the U-boats was not achieved by any single weapon or tactic. It was the result of countless contributions from countless people. Scientists who invented new radar systems, factory workers who built escort ships, merchant sailors who kept sailing despite the danger, codebreakers who worked in secret for years, radio operators who listened through static-filled nights, naval officers who plotted positions on maps and made decisions that determined who lived and who died. The SOS signals that German submarines sent in their moments of desperation became symbols of their defeat. These calls for help, transmitted in the universal language of Morse code, were meant to summon rescue. Instead, they revealed positions to the enemy. They confirmed that tracking methods were working. They showed that the invisible fleet was becoming visible. In the end, the U-boat war came down to a simple truth. A fleet that depended on secrecy could not survive once its secrets were exposed. The Germans built their submarines to operate in darkness. They never imagined that their enemies would learn to see in the dark. Today, the Battle of the Atlantic is remembered as one of the longest and most important campaigns of the Second World War. It lasted from the first day of the conflict to the last. It was fought not on land, but on and under the ocean. Its heroes were not soldiers charging across battlefields, but sailors enduring weeks of tension and terror in small boats, surrounded by endless water. The lessons of that campaign echo into the present. Electronic warfare, signals intelligence, code breaking, these are now fundamental parts of military strategy. The principles developed during the U-boat war shape how nations protect their secrets and attack those of their enemies. But perhaps the most important lesson is simpler. The deadliest fleet in history was defeated not by force alone, but by knowledge. Understanding the enemy proved more powerful than any torpedo. Listening proved more valuable than shooting. And the SOS signals meant to save lives ended up exposing a hidden armada to destruction. The shadows beneath the waves have passed into history. The submarines rest in the deep. The sailors who fought on both sides are mostly gone now, their stories fading with time. But the echoes of their struggle remain, reminding us that, in warfare, as in life, what you cannot see can still destroy you on, what seems hidden may already be known.